We've been talking for a few weeks now about the work our presenting sponsor TELUS is doing to better Indigenous lives through the power of digital connectivity. 178 Indigenous communities serviced and hundreds of millions of dollars invested, with more to come on both counts. So the commitment is huge. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. It's really about the difference high-speed internet makes to quality of life on a daily basis, something a lot of us just take for granted. They don't take it for granted on Williams Lake First Nation, 300 kilometers northwest of Kamloops in BC, where simple things like opening an email attachment or connecting to social media were impossible because of how slow their internet was. Not being able to move at the speed of business, not being able to engage their membership or provide basic services people need, meant they couldn't share in the successes and opportunities of living in Canada. Then, all of that changed. This past summer, Williams Lake was among 56 First Nation communities connected to TELUS Pure Fibre, working in partnership with TELUS and the province's Connecting BC Fund. Now the band's teachers, lawyers, social workers, artists, tradespeople, and entrepreneurs have access to the business tools and technology they need to succeed. It's life-changing stuff. Online education and remote healthcare services are now instantly available too, absolutely critical during the pandemic. None of this is easy work. There are hurdles. As I said, it takes the committed partnership of governments, federal, provincial, and Indigenous, working alongside TELUS to get over those hurdles. But it's the right work, and it needs to get done. You can read more about it at telus.com/Indigenous connectivity. All right, holidaying Herle Burly-ites, welcome to our very last pod of 2020. Despite its weirdness, difficulties, and downright tragedies, I feel damn thankful that all of you Herle Burly-ites stuck with us this year. Doing the show is such a joy for me, and I'm gratified that you let me, my friends Scott and Jenni, and my arcane references to Saskatchewan Roughrider linemen of the 70s and 80s, you're a beauty, Roger Aldag, into your earbuds all year long. This week is a one-parter. We've got researcher and pollster Frank Graves. Frank is the founder and president of Ekos Research Associates. He's advised governments and ministers on matters of public policy and is a frequent commentator in both Canadian and American media. Frank has always had three things that I know: a better golf swing than me, a better car than I have, and a more successful company than I have. But despite that, he's a very good friend of mine. And I know, because I've been creeping his Twitter feed, and he posted about it just the other night, that he feels particularly bullish about 2021. Frank, I believe you used the word pumped. So we're going to talk about why Frank is pumped for 2021. We're going to talk about how his research shows growing strands of authoritarianism in our society. We're going to talk about the response to the pandemic, and we're going to talk about Canadian politics and where the parties sit as we enter 2021, likely an election year. Hey, Frank, welcome to the Herle Burly.
I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you, David. It's just a highlight of what's been an otherwise somewhat gloomy year. But as you point out, I think we're looking at it's not going to be hard to beat 2020, but I think 2021 is going to be a great year.
Great. Well, let's start with how you are. 9 months into the pandemic, sitting there in your condo in Ottawa. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a strange year, but just the researcher in me, that part of it, it's been like an unprecedented collision of economic and health risks. And I've been watching this through the prism of my polling apparatus every day since the beginning of March. So I've never seen such profound shifts in a public. I've never seen such profound shifts in attitudes or even behavior. It's really quite remarkable. It's as frightening as it is impressive, but I must say it's had my full attention. So it's been a really remarkable year.
So let's jump right into that then. You'd probably thought, Frank, you were already an established person in this business when I first met you, and I'm old as stone now. So you probably would have thought that you probably would have thought that you'd seen everything. What have been the impacts of the pandemic on how Canadians think?
Yes, you are still a relative puppy, but we have been doing this for some time. And in a long and really fascinating career, I literally have never seen such a rapid period of transformation in public outlook, and nothing even close. This is a once in a lifetime type of event, and it's wreaked incredible changes on the Canadian public. And it's uncertain what will happen going forward. I'll just give you a quick example. When we first started polling on these topics, and I've had a longitudinal sample going since early March, where we've basically been in the field pretty well every day, about 5% of Canadians said, I'm using a mask. The last time I asked, which was a couple of days ago, it was 95%. Think about that. Like, when have we ever seen such a profound transformation in behavior in a 9-month period? It took decades to convince people to stop smoking, to put on a seatbelt, to use condoms after the HIV crisis. This is, really quite remarkable. We saw the levels of trust in government in Canada, and I work with others who are monitoring these in Europe and America, reached the highest levels we've seen in 40 years. Meanwhile, in the United States, where I polled in their most recent election, we saw the lowest levels in 50 years. So you see this, Canadians look to government with a level of anxiety and hope that we haven't seen in a long time. And, they've largely been, while, they're not out in the street going Hosanna, they've been pretty comfortable. Interestingly, this may reshape the sort of relationship between senior governments, federalism, because what we've seen in recent weeks is that months is that confidence in provincial governments has actually been declining precipitously, whereas confidence in the federal government has been relatively intact. But overall, I guess if there's no atheists in a foxhole, there's no libertarians in a pandemic. And Canadians, more so than other countries, have invested a lot of hope in governments to do whatever it takes to get through this. And we'll see where that goes from here. But I think we might end up with a very different society a year or two out from now than we would have if this had never happened. And that's why I'm optimistic about 2021 and 2022, that as vicious and as cruel as this pandemic has been, it may provide an accelerant to allow a lot of things that people wanted to happen to actually occur that would not have been possible without this incredible disruption. So we'll see, but I know that the majority of Canadians think that we're on the cusp of a great transformation. I won't use reset because apparently that term is colored by some of the political commentary. But I do think people think that we're going to come out of this as a different world, and that the pandemic has laid bare a lot of the fault lines in Canadian society, and not just unique to Canada, which require, attention and which would otherwise have been left neglected, whether it's dealing with, issues around climate change, racial injustice, Indigenous, reconciliation, the hyper concentration of wealth at the top. All of these things are receiving scores in terms of the attention that the public want this to get, which are literally 30, 40-year highs in the polling we've been doing. So that's we'll see whether that actually comes to any sort of fruition, but it is quite astonishing, really.
Frank, I was finding that back in the spring, and you're more current than I am. Is that holding? Because, back in the spring, I was one of these people that was kind of optimistic that the pandemic was going to result in some of the societal changes you're talking about. But I've been discouraged over time as I've seen, for instance, grocery store workers withdraw danger pay from their employees and nobody care. As I've seen the same tragedy happen in long-term care homes in Wave 2 as happened in Wave 1, and seemingly no political implications from that. I'm feeling more like the status quo pressures are stronger than the change pressures right now.
Well, you're absolutely right. There have been some changes since the outset, and one of the things we saw at the beginning of the pandemic was a lot of the egregious fault lines that were dividing Canadians, the polarization, which was incredibly intense, diminished as everybody thought, oh, we better pull together. Now, as the pandemic has gone on, and remember that in March, when I asked Canadians, how long do you think this thing is going to last? 2/3 said it, well, it'll be over in 6 months. Whereas obviously today, it's more like maybe it'll be over in 2 years. But that polarization, which was gripping the country in the aftermath of our election, and which was in my research pretty well as intense as what you see in the United States, despite the fact that Canadians would mostly tell you, oh, it's not here. It's crept back in, and it's really now expressing itself into extreme divisions on not only how to deal with the pandemic, but also what comes next. And what we've called this open order axis, which is similar to the same kinds of axis that we see occurring in the United States and other countries, is actually now the principal fault line, which is dividing us. And it's now become a debate which is superimposed itself on what do we do about the pandemic, but also what comes after. And so you'll see the consensus views about things like the need to deal with reconciliation, hyper-concentration of wealth, to move to a greener economy, to a balancing of society, which puts more prominence on things like health, education, human capital, rather than just GDP growth. That still has remained relatively intact as a majority view, but there is an other alternate view about let's have thicker borders, let's pull up the drawbridge, let's turn back the clock. The fragility of global supply chains has been something which has been clearly laid bare by the pandemic. So therefore, maybe we should retreat into some form of economic nationalism. That also is kind of lurking out there. And we find that despite the fact, as we've now at a point where we have like two forces which were somewhat unpredictable. In the summer, most people thought that the worst was over. The curve had been flattened, things looked okay, and so people were beginning to feel like we can start thinking about the end of this. That's been shattered. The second wave, which we weren't even sure was going to happen, is here, and it's actually worse than the first wave, and it's going to get worse still. But the other opposing force is the arrival of vaccines, which has given people a sense that there is actually light at the end of the tunnel, that this thing will kind of recede into the rearview mirror at some point. And the collision of those two forces has really produced some interesting responses in the public. But what it has also done is we've seen now that whereas we got this roughly 80-20 rule, about 80% of Canadians are going, let's actually hunker down. We do see some salvation at some point in the future. But let's not waste any more lives. Let's do what it takes to be safe. But that compliant majority is offset by this increasingly defiant, disinformed, discontented minority, which looks a lot like the authoritarian populists that we've been studying before this thing came. And they're not only not on side, they're basically going, this is something which is not real. It's exaggerated. Vaccines are dangerous. Masks are things that are, make things worse. And like this, and when you start kind of parsing where do those views come from, you can see that this is a group that are, low information. They're economically feeling a sense of fear and despair. And they're making, this is making things extremely challenging as we move from whatever we are today to the safe harbor of this vaccine period, which we'll see how long it takes. But that kind of contest about how do we deal with the pandemic, also it translates into two different, very starkly different visions about what the post-pandemic world would be. And I personally don't think we're going to go back to the status quo. And frankly, neither do most Canadians. We'll see. I mean, we've had, this is a disruption on a scale that we haven't seen in literally, in our lifetimes. And, those sorts of things have typically produced, pretty broad transformations in the societies in the aftermath. Will that happen this time? I don't know. most Canadians think it will. I personally think we're going to see a different world emerge at the other end. Is it going to be like completely different? No, there'll be some things which will look quite similar. But I do think on some of the fundamental questions, we will see a world which will be much more different than would have happened if this event had not occurred. And I think there will be a contest for that. And if we want to talk about what the next election is going to be about, I think that's what it's going to be about. It's going to be a vision war about, do you want this more open kind of Canada that welcomes some of these opportunities to correct some of the fault lines that have been laid bare by the pandemic, or do you want to kind of turn back the clock a bit and go to this more ordered Canada, which is kind of safer, more familiar? And I don't know what the outcome will be. I think it'll be a very interesting contest, though.
What are the proportions of those two groups in Canada, ordered and open?
That's a really interesting question, and we've tracked this using indicators, and we've measured this in the United States, and I've worked with colleagues in the United States, and there's also people who looked at this in Europe and particularly in the UK. In the United States, Pew estimates that authoritarians account for 45% of the public, and in our work in Canada using similar indicators, it looks like it could be as high as 35%. But it actually looked like that kind of shrank a bit and was down in maybe I would say 30% for sure, with about 20% being hardcore Northern Trumpists and another 10 to 15% that can move in or out of that particular category. One of the interesting features is that if you look at the drivers of why this sort of authoritarian reflex has occurred at this time, and it's taken, in our view, many decades that it's percolated the forces that have produced it. It appears that one of the key drivers, though, is a sense of economic despair about the future. A group that feels left behind, that they're not going to do better than their parents, that they no longer belong to the middle class. In Canada, the United States, at the beginning of this century, about 70% of Canadians and Americans located themselves as self-defined members of the middle class. In the United States, that number is now about 45%, which means 70 million Americans have fallen out of the middle class in the first 2 decades of this century. And that has produced an enormous, not just an economic disruption for those who have felt that, but also a sense of lost status, a sense of lost identity. And that's, I think, one of the things which underpins this. There's more to it than that. And that's occurred in Canada as well, the same numbers. Although, interestingly, Canada and the United States were working in lockstep on that particular indicator. We have seen Canadian self-identified membership in the middle class rising since 2015. Remember, the government placed this at the top of their agenda as something there, and they haven't solved the problem. But interestingly, in Canada now, the instance of people locating themselves in the self-identified middle class is about 55%, which is up 5 points, whereas it's down 5 points in the United States, which might explain why we're seeing, some of the authoritarian populist forces a little more subdued in Canada than they are in the United States. But I don't think that, like, for example, we polled in the United States in late August, found the race to be very tight, but we had used our indicator, which is drawn from some basic questions which ask nothing about politics. They ask questions about child rearing. When you're raising a child, do you think it's more important to stress obedience or creativity, for example? And if you put together 4 or 5 simple questions like this, it becomes your best predictor of who voted for Donald Trump or who voted to leave Brexit. And in fact, it was the best predictor of who voted for the Conservatives in the last election. Despite the fact that this is something which most Canadians sneer or deny at, it was, and I've got a published article in the University of Calgary's Policy Journal showing that this predictor was actually the #1 predictor of Conservative vote in the last election. And it wouldn't have predicted Conservative vote in, say, 2011. It would have been related, but it wouldn't have been the principal predictor. When I asked the question in the United States again, it actually was even more tightly predictive of voting than it was in 2016 when it was the best predictor. So the idea that, the election of Biden has kind of solved this problem. I'm glad that as most Canadians that we've seen a regime change. Most Canadians felt very, very emphatically that was necessary for America to recover any sort of health. But to think that this has suddenly solved that deep problem is a mirage, and the same sort of forces are at play in Canada as well. So I personally think this is something that's really poorly understood, and it's a critical ingredient to trying to make any progress on dealing with this intense polarization that we see in our society.
Okay, so there's two follow-ups I want on that, Frank. One of which is, it's been very disconcerting to see in the United States post-election how many people choose an outcome they prefer over a democratic outcome. How thin the commitment to actual democracy has been in the United States. Would we find, in a similar situation, would we find the same thing in Canada?
I certainly don't think we can discount it. I've seen actually international research which has measured what another dimension of what we talk about, effective polarization, which is the degree to which people feel contempt for the other main contender politically. And of the 8 countries that were considered in this study, only Canada and the United States worked in lockstep to be at the top of the heap. In fact, in Europe and Germany, for example, effective polarization is lower than it was in the 90s. In Canada, it continues to rise. So the idea that this is something that we're immune from in Canada, that we're somehow, better and this couldn't grip us is simply untrue. The fact that we have a lower incidence of people who are in the thrall of authoritarian populism that, is mildly comforting. But remember, we operate under a first past the post system with a fragmented center left, so that the yardsticks for success for this sort of a movement are much more modest than they are in the United States. And so I don't think we should rule it out. And I know this is something that the Conservative Party is struggling with, because we see in the Conservative Party a blend of the traditional status quo conservatives, which is what Terence Stenner has called this part, which is akin to the kind of, traditional Republican in the United States. Remember, Republicans in the Reagan era were suburban, affluent, college educated, believed in minimal government, free trade. That's got nothing to do with the current sort of, Trump populists who are overwhelmingly working class, poorly educated, angry, feeling left behind. And, the degree to which this has sorted the political domains in both Canada and the United States is remarkable. If I look at the data that I have tracking things like the instance of conservatives and liberals who, for example, agreed with the, proposition that there's too many visible minorities coming to the country. In 2012, conservatives agreed more so than Canadians, than liberals. The differences were, however, modest. So about 45% of conservatives said there's too many visible minorities, but it was 35% for liberals. Wasn't that different? As we came out of the last election, those numbers were 15% for liberals and 70% for conservatives. We saw similar polarization occurring on issues like trust in science, trust in mainstream media, the incidence of conservatives who identified themselves as working class as opposed to middle class. So I don't think people recognize how swift and profound some of this sorting is that has gone on. And but what you see now is in Canada, as in the United States, conservatives are sort of this new kind of populist, anti-intellectual, angry, frightened portion that's hostile to outgroups, that doesn't believe in climate change or science. But then you have the sort of traditional status quo conservatives that are really not of that ilk. But frankly, the political challenge to form government, given the strength of this new authoritarian populist component of the party, it's really a tremendously challenging juggling act. You don't want. That's why you see, I think, the conservatives having this difficulty trying to kind of speak to their traditional constituency and to the center portion of the spectrum, but at the same time, not to alienate this group of new ordered populists. Because frankly, if they are cut loose, the conservative constituency, is probably smaller than the NDP constituency right now. So it's a really stern challenge for them.
Does this base of theirs, this different kind of voter that you're describing, did that mean, like, I mean, there's a template for that we've seen for COVID management. Like Trudeau could ride this to a majority. Like he has strong approval for how he's handled COVID, as do many other leaders of governments. COVID killed Trump's chances of re-election. He had a pretty good chance of re-election before COVID, and COVID killed his chances of re-election. But did he actually, even if he was intellectually disposed to do it, did he, or does Kenny in Alberta have the ability to have Trudeau Ford type messaging, or does their base force them into a more laissez-faire approach to this?
That's a great question. And there's initially, there wasn't that much division in Canadians about issues around how to respond to the pandemic. The questions of whether it was real, should they put a mask on? There was some connections to partisanship, but they were modest. What we see now is whether or not you trust the government and whether or not you feel the country's moving in the right direction are now the principal predictors of how you should deal with the pandemic, how real the problem is, what the right prescription for getting through it is. And that's something which it's really hard to imagine how you can kind of straddle those divisions. You point out, the government has received pretty good marks, the federal government. The provincial governments actually received better marks at the outset. Canadians were looking at both their senior levels of government going, okay, do whatever it takes, and we're on side with you. So we saw that the support for provincial governments handling was running at about 75% right through until the summer. But what's happened, particularly in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, to a lesser extent, Ontario, is you've seen a very sharp and precipitous decline in confidence in those governments. Meanwhile, the federal government, which is largely a source of contempt in a lot of those parts of the country, has hung in pretty well. And so I think Canadians are going to judge how the ballot question in the next election will probably be how you dealt with this. And in particular, it's becoming probably even more focused on how did you deal with rolling out the vaccine. So if the current government, the incumbent, is successful in meeting the relatively modest yardsticks that it's established for vaccine rollout, and if there's an election, say in the spring, which I think there probably will be, I think they'll win. I think the current government will probably get a majority, even though I only see them right now in our polling as being up by 5 or 6 points. But that 5 or 6 points is concentrated in areas of the country, which would, I think, probably yield a majority. Remember,
BC and Ontario, right? BC and Ontario?
Yeah, and they're doing quite well in Quebec, which is something I don't think people are commenting on. But the Conservatives are doing very poorly in Quebec, notwithstanding the new leader's ability to actually speak French. And but if you take Alberta and Saskatchewan out of play, the Conservatives don't even come close to having a lead anywhere else in the rest of the country. So you can win all those seats 2 or 3 times, but they're only available once. And so I would see the current numbers producing probably producing a liberal majority. Not probably, they would, even though that's not typical in the range of normally what you see for a majority.
Right. Well, let's get back to that in a second, but I've got a couple more pandemic questions I want to ask you that are related to politics. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the vaccine rollout, and you mentioned if they're able to hit the modest targets that they've put out, which I'm not actually even sure what they are, to be honest. But I get the impression that some large number of people are supposed to be vaccinated by September. I'm not sure what the total is, but isn't it all relative? No matter what we're doing vis-a-vis our targets, If the States is vaccinating at a 100-to-1 ratio over us, is that not going to be a political problem for the government?
Absolutely. And I know what right now, because I'm testing and I'm experimentally testing, how does the public respond to, say, if we had, say, 3 million people vaccinated by the end of March versus 6 million versus, 9 million. And the public are relatively, at this stage, patient. They go, I'd be okay with any of those scenarios. I'd feel better if there was a bigger number. Remember, there's a quarter of the public that don't want to be vaccinated at all, which is the link to a lot of the forces we've been talking about. But the public also tell us that if the government, and I think their goal at this stage, and it's a movable feast, is to get, whatever is herd immunity required done by September, which would be 75% by September, which, and the public say, yeah, that would be fine. Now, does their view of that change if they see that 75% of Americans are vaccinated by March? Yes, it would. And similarly, I mean, Europe's got a much more aggressive rollout strategy going. Frankly, the out of the gates, I mean, I think the federal government managed to under promise and over deliver on the issue of whether we'd have any vaccine. Rolling out some vaccine in December was something which was never really part of the plan. And the fact that we have that is good, but the at least, the initial rollout has been underwhelming, to say the least. We've had something like 90,000 vaccine in Ontario, of which I think 12,000 have been rolled out to date. I think the UK's at over 1 million right now, and the Americans probably ahead of that as well. So yeah, I think Canadians will get pretty fractious if they see that, oh yeah, we're getting vaccinated, but like we're way behind what's going on in Europe and America. And I do think that will become a critical point that will be used to evaluate the government. And yes, if they fall badly behind, I think they can be, if they're a month behind the Americans, I don't think that's a big deal. If they're 6 months behind, I think that's a really big deal. So we'll see.
Right. Yeah. Proof will be in the pudding. The other question I have for you is long-term care. So both Legault and Ford have overseen thousands of people die in the most tragic of circumstances in long-term care homes. Many, many experts say that a lot of that was preventable. So why are those two governments not paying a political price for what's happened in long-term care? Legault actually still has huge approval ratings for handling of COVID, but both Legault and Ford look like they would be reelected handily right now in an election campaign, despite having had something that terrible happen on their watch.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I would offer the caveat that in the summer, the provincial government in Quebec enjoyed 85% confidence levels in their handling of the pandemic. In last week, when we checked, it was 50%. So it's not like there hasn't been any impact. And a similar precipitous decline in Ontario, where the confidence in the provincial handling of the pandemic is now in the low 40s, where it was in the mid 70s. You're right that this doesn't seem to have caught up when we look at vote intention. I don't get the Conservatives in the 40s, which some have. I have them in the mid 30s, but I have in Ontario, but I have the NDP and Liberal vote almost evenly split, such that they probably would form government again. Is that a good proposition? I think if they continue, at least in Ontario, on the path that they are right now with this, turtle-like response to rolling out the vaccine, no, they will get punished. I don't think they will form government. I don't think Jason Kenney's going to form government in Alberta again. He's had a 23% approval rating for handling of the pandemic. Legault, that's another issue. Long-term care, interestingly, that is, and like we've fumbled that horribly in this country. Even in the United States, which has had set a lower bar, which is one of the reasons we're not more angry with our governments than we would have been. we have been singularly terrible on handling of that particular issue. What I see in the data when I ask on this is Canadians want a national plan for long-term care. They want the federal government to step up to the plate and say, this is something, maybe we need to make this entirely public, but we certainly can't allow this to happen again. And yeah, there will be accounting for that. I don't think Canadians really recognize fully, except for those who've come in first-hand contact, just how dreadful our performance has been on that front. But yeah, I do think there will be a political price to be paid for that as well.
I see that. I think that's got to be the soft underbelly of the Ford government.
I totally agree. I don't know. I personally think I would rate the Ford government's chances of re-election right now at 50-50. I would have rated them in the summer at 90-10. I would have rated them in February at 40-60. So it's definitely moving around. We'll see what happens.
Okay, well, that's a good. First of all, I've got to take a break, Frank, and have a word from our sponsor, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
So here's the thing about trains. Because of momentum and the laws of physics, they consume way less fuel than trucks. And in the last several years, railroad companies have used technology to make trains awfully long. Some are more than 4 kilometers. That's nearly 2.5 miles for those of us who still think that way. A modern train can take hundreds of trucks off the road, which is sort of a big deal these days. But here's another thing about trains. They have to be unloaded. Their cargo, automobiles, grain, household consumer goods, whatever, has to travel the last mile by truck. That's just reality. Unloading requires a terminal where containers can be transferred from trains to trucks for local delivery. Without a transfer terminal, the whole system chokes up. And the area around Toronto needs a new terminal. It's the fastest growing market in the country. Its appetite for cargo is voracious. At the moment, CN trains have to stop in Montreal, and cargo is continuing to the Golden Horseshoe by truck. Thousands and thousands of trucks. It should be going by train. So our sponsor, CN, has for the past 5 years been trying to open a new transfer terminal in Milton, southwest of the GTA. An environmental assessment had to be done. CN did the work. There were thousands of consultations with environmentalists, local governments, and Indigenous groups. Accommodations were made. And ultimately, the government's assessment panel decided there is indeed a compelling case for a new terminal. CN has worked with the local communities. It sold them land, invested millions, and guaranteed wetland and habitat enhancements. It's been a long 5 years, but CN understood the need for all the hurdles and hoops. Final approval is now up to Cabinet. The job is shovel-ready, it will create jobs, and it will unclog an artery in the Canadian economy. Regulation should not mean inertia. It's time to start work. Okay, Frank, so that's a good segue into this question. Given the fact that the polling industry punted the U.S. election, why does anybody give a shit what you and I have to say about what's going to happen in politics anyway?
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure how bad the punt was. If we look at the U.S. election, I think it...
Come on, it was bad. Nobody told me that was a close election, Frank. Nobody told me that was a close election.
Yeah, it's funny. I did a poll from Canada at the end of August, and I had them 2 points apart. And I thought, this is wrong. I'm not even putting this out. Yeah. I did put it out, but it turns out it wasn't wrong. But I think the final aggregate national polling is within 3.5 points of the outcome. It looked much, much worse because of the mail-in and advanced voting. So in the, and even the predictions, 48 of 50 states were predicted accurately. And if you use the kind of typical yardstick of performance, I think this was not a particularly bad performance. It's on par with what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years in the United States. I think Canadian polling does a better job. But it is clear where it went wrong. And I think first of all, there was a whole pile of really not very good polling. 85% of the polls were opt-in online stuff, which didn't seem to catch any of the movements. And that's another issue that we'll talk to, not your non-technical viewers who aren't interested in that, but I do think it's a big problem. The big problem...
Does it relate, Frank? Does it relate to your ordered authoritarian segmentation? A. Smith, who's one of the leading Democratic operatives, was on after the election, and he was talking about a pollster that he had talked to who said that he had an unusual number of non-completes on surveys and hadn't looked at them, and in retrospect wished he'd looked at them. Because we assume in the polling business that non-completes are the same as everybody else. But his theory was maybe they're not. Maybe people heard a poll that obviously was not by them, for them, that was some establishment figure that they don't trust, and that they weren't responding to it. And that there were Trump voters out there that couldn't be polled by the Washington Post. Do you believe that?
No, absolutely. That's exactly what went wrong, in my opinion. I hear people trot out the shy Trump thesis, which is a variation on the shy Tories. Actually, the polling we did in the United States from Canada provided us with a good test of that particular hypothesis, because we used IVR to talk to landlines. We can't call IVR by our cell phones by IVR from Canada or anywhere, because you'll get killed by the FCC. So we did them with live operator. And so I got a chance to match the cohorts of similar age groups and to compare the incidence of those who said, I'm voting for Donald Trump, either with the anonymous robot versus with a live interviewer. The thesis, if it's true, that shy Tories and shy Trump voters were less likely to disclose that to a live operator, is absolute nonsense. If anything, there was a bold Trump effect. The people who spoke to the live operator, who were the same age categories, were actually more likely to say, I'm voting for Donald Trump. So we can throw that canard out the window. On the other hand, I do believe that there is a group of Trump voters who are driven by this authoritarian populist reflex, and who are institutionally mistrustful, not just of science and government, but of polling and fake news and media and so forth. So they're systematically less likely to appear. And if they do appear, they maybe drop off more quickly. That's a critical problem. I know that pollsters in the United States made great efforts to try and correct for the underrepresentation of non-college educated voters, which caused some of the myths in 2016. But even though they got those numbers, and I worked with Pew and others, CNN guys I talked to, they still miss, because I think there's not just the demographic, there's a psychographic, which goes back to this, deeply mistrustful, frightened, angry, left behind crowd who don't trust anybody. What we're doing actually in Canada, just as a lesson from this, is we're trying very hard to not just balance our probability panel with those demographics. We're trying to kind of make sure that we have that psychographic represented as well, because I think it provides, it gives you a kind of overall level of noise in terms of understanding whatever the issue of the day is. It's the pandemic or response to government. If you don't have those people in your sample, you're going to miss not just elections, but just understanding where the public truly are. So yes, I think that's absolutely what's central to the failure. And it was a systematic failure. I don't think it was egregious. As we counted all the ballots and the margin became, the final margin, it wasn't that bad, but it was always underrepresenting Trump. And I think it's basically this reason, that the same people that show up at a Trump rally are just less likely to take an interview. And we have to figure that one out, not just to predict elections, but to get a representative sample.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. All right, now that we've established that we have credibility, let's pivot to the Canadian political scene. Going into 2021, you and I both think there's going to be an election this spring. What is each party's biggest challenge heading into an election? Start with the Liberals.
Well, the Liberals have to basically get through this critical period of, rising anxiety about the levels of infections, deaths, hospitalizations, to the point where people say, okay, the vaccine's actually working. This monster's in the rearview mirror. If they can pull that off, I believe they will be rewarded with a majority. If they fumble that, then I think that bet's is off. If we move to the opposition, it's a tough time.
Just
for
wait
opposition.
1 second. What do people think about Trudeau? Is Trudeau ahead of the party or behind the party?
I think he's about on par. And actually, I've never seen a situation where the answer was so different whether you ask women or men. So Trudeau is doing very poorly with men. He's doing very well with women. If women only were voting, he'd get a Mulroney-like majority from 250 seats or something. If only men were voting, he'd lose. So that's a peculiarity, but it's a stable feature. It goes to other demographics as well, but but overall, I'd say he's doing better. Obviously, I mean, if I was to look at the polls in February, he wasn't doing very well. He's just a guy who should have won a second majority, kind of sipping beer as he went to the finish line. He had like a pretty good economy, no national crises. This would be kind of a pro forma anointment, and it was really iffy whether he won at all. So in purely political terms, the pandemic and how it's been handled by him and his party has been very helpful for him. And I think he's running about on par, but as I say, he's really got a problem with men, and we can.
Why is that? What are men seeing that they don't like?
It's really men in like the 35 to 65 cohort, which really have a problem with him. And I don't know. I suspect if we were to really do the focus groups and probe on this, they kind of think he suffers from chronic do-goodism, and they find a lot of the continued sort of return to some of the themes around identity politics. It just kind of grates on them, even if they agree with those points. So I think that's at the heart of it. But I'd have to do some more detailed tests, but I know the problem is really real, and it becomes stronger as you move into that group who are, for example, not university educated, not feeling as buoyant about the economic future. And it isn't just I'm not really approving him. There's a sort of visceral contempt for him, and so that's an issue. It's actually akin to a different version of the problems that Premier Wynne experienced in Ontario, and I also, both of us would probably scratch our heads, fully understanding when you look at the policy record and where the people who felt this contempt, and you go, I don't understand it. And so, but I guess that's another failure that we'll have to figure out as to better understand. But I think,
yeah, I'm a little late on that.
I hear you.
What would the Conservatives have to do? What would OToole and the Conservatives have to do to get to 40 points?
It's hard to imagine. I don't think I've been looking at this pretty carefully lately, and I look at it, and OToole he's just not registering, and it's, you go, okay, it's been a tough period. We've had obviously a pandemic where it's really put a lot of focus on the Prime Minister and the premiers, but if you're an opposition leader or member of opposition, it's hard to get much airtime. It's hard to get much attention. And when you do, it sounds like you're being kind of whiny. But even putting that aside, the awareness levels for him are like brutal. The approval levels, for those who know of him, I don't see, apart from on the fiscal front where he gets like a tiny advantage, every other issue he's like behind. And when we get to the critical issue, which is the pandemic, he's in real trouble. The public say, he might be an okay guy. I might, under normal circumstances have a look, but I just don't trust this guy on the most important issue of my life, which is the pandemic, how to handle it and what comes next. So I really think he's in pretty serious trouble. So I don't think there's much he can do. What I think he's got to hope for is that there's a big pratfall on the part of the Liberals, that, we find the Americans and the Brits are all inoculated and going to the beach in April, and we're sitting there like waiting for our supply. That could become a really big problem. But I don't think there's much within the orbit at this stage of OToole that can change the outcome for him. He's got to hope that there's a screw up on the other side.
Let's say if you could be the leader of that party and you could wave a magic wand and do one thing, would you, to help the Conservatives do better in public opinion terms, would you change their position on climate, or would you change their position on social conservatism?
Boy, that's a tough one.
Which is the bigger impediment to them in the areas they need to grow in the country?
If you look at the constituency for the Conservatives right now, and I mean, if you take a really hard look, the incidence of those who are in their base who feel climate's an important issue is pretty slim. If you look at the incidence of those, I think I would probably say they'd have more prospects from cutting loose the social conservative side and kind of rebuilding on where we have a plan for the economy of the future, which is going to recognize the lessons we learned from the pandemic. It doesn't have as much of China in it as more of the UK and New Zealand, Australia. That kind of a path, I think, would probably be one that says we're going to rebuild manufacturing in Canada. We're going to be more careful about having, borders which are thicker and more protective of this. I think there's a message that around those themes that could appeal to enough people for them to be successful. And so I don't think they can present themselves, as the champions of, a new Green Deal or anything like that. So I think if they were to jettison one area, it would probably be the social conservatives. I think that's probably something that's holding them back. That'd be hard to do, but if they were given that blunt choice, I would think they were better off, jettisoning the social conservatives, the extreme ones.
Right. So in the spring, I was looking at some data that indicated to me not only what you were saying, that people had dramatically increased trust in government and trust in government to do the right things, but that there was a huge activist agenda out there, that people, although a little spooked about debt levels, were really supportive of a lot of major government reforms, whether that be childcare or whether that be basic income, all kinds of the things to address the fissures that you are talking about. And I was looking at that data and I was saying, why aren't the NDP taking off? And I was kind of critical of why the NDP couldn't take advantage of this circumstance. But recently, I think I've seen some polls that show them with a number that starts with a 2. Are they making a move?
Yeah, I don't see that in my polling. I see them stuck. I see his approval numbers going up. And you're absolutely right. Their policy positions are now probably closer to the mainstream of where Canadians are than any other party, and by quite a margin. But we've seen that in the past with the NDP failing to get much success out of that. And I think it's largely driven by the fact that you might have the positions we agree with, but you're not going to be government, and therefore I'm not going to waste my vote with you. And I think that problem continues to plague them. But I do believe you're absolutely right that the support for an activist, progressive agenda is at the highest levels I've seen in literally 30 years.
Right.
And it's interesting because, and I've been polling on this regularly, the public are aware of the fact that we are taking on massive debt. It's not like they're completely buying the idea, we're borrowing so you don't have to, and interest rates are low and it'll all be fine. They're going, right, keep your foot on the gas because we understand how bad things are, but we don't buy that crap at all. We think there's going to be program cuts. We think there's going to be tax raises. We don't believe that there's, some pain-free kind of non-sticker shock, buyer remorse future. But that at the same time, they're saying it doesn't mean that we're not going to stop doing what we have to do right now. So it's an unusual point. I've never seen this kind of, position in the public in polling for a long time. And I don't know, I personally think if the Conservatives can sort of keep things in abeyance until the fall, they probably have a much better chance of being successful at that point, because I believe at that point some of the sticker shock might have set in. But yeah, it is a point where I look at and how are we going to pay for that? When I start looking at that, and obviously the answers are always anything but me. So I look at, well, should we add a point or two to the GST? Absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. Should we introduce a wealth tax? Oh yeah, right on. How about luxury tax?
Yeah.
Good idea. Let's tax the digital giants. Absolutely. How about a wealth tax? All of these things are off the charts, and I think they're based on partly a sincere belief that you need to adjust and bring some equity, but they're also based on that means I won't have to pay for it. But yeah, it's really and there is support for things like universal basic income, 4-day work week, and I think those things will actually become really hot points of discussion, because I don't believe we're looking at we're certainly not looking at a V-shaped recovery, maybe not even a U-shaped recovery, hopefully not the dreaded L-shaped recovery. But I think we are looking at a K recovery, which is those people who have university educations, professional credentials. They haven't been damaged very much. They've done pretty well, and they're probably going to continue to do well. Those who are in the service part of the economy, the gig economy, if they can even return to a job, which might not exist as AI and automation and other things are showing we can do some of these things without real people, that's going to become a critical challenge for the economies of the future. The other thing I think we've been seeing, I saw some data about the acceleration of wealth amongst billionaires in Canada, which is something that's not well understood. But I saw a number which appeared, I think, in Bloomberg the other day, that Jeff Bezos, if he was to take the money that his wealth has increased by since the pandemic arrived, he could afford to give every single employee $100,000 and still be ahead of where his wealth was in March. And people go, oh, that doesn't sound right. It probably
my
isn't.
impression, Frank, is that people don't know how rich the rich are now.
You're right. And I've actually polled on that, and others have as well. And even when you were to show conservatives or Republicans in the States what the actual distribution of wealth is and say, okay, what should we do with it? They'll redesign it in a way that look totally like a Marxist model for the future. So no, there is a very poor level of literacy about just how much. Let's be clear. In this century in Canada, United States now, we're looking at a GDP growth, particularly if we factor in the last year, that might be 1% growth each year. Meanwhile, the concentration of wealth in the upper 1% is now probably in the same range as it was in the robber baron era, which led to the Great Depression. Those numbers in the last half of the 20th century, the average GDP growth was maybe 6-7%, but it actually the concentration of wealth in the top 1% was in the 5% range. And so everybody was moving ahead relatively at the same level. That's changed. That model, an extractive economy, I don't think it's sustainable in the long run. And if anything, I think there will be a reckoning where the awareness of this is going to heighten. You've got people in the United States, and I think to be honest, in Canada, we may not have done a brilliant job on the actual public health side of this. It's been okay. But I think we've done a really good job on the economic backstop that we provided for citizens. And you look to our south, and you see lineups, the wealthiest country on the planet, with food lineups, and you go, this is what's wrong here anyway. So I think there will be a reckoning at the end of this. So,
okay, one last political question for you, which is, you mentioned the resistance to any tax increases that people have, and the economic insecurities and fears that they have. I had noticed, again, in my research in the spring and summer, that a lot of the people who normally are the mainstays of the climate change file, particularly middle-aged women, had been diverted in their attentions from climate change to more immediate issues, and that climate change was a lower order priority than it might have been a year ago. Is the carbon tax increase the Liberals are proposing survivable in an election campaign?
It's a really good question. I'm finding that support for climate change and not a new Green Deal, but a better rebalancing of the economy and sustainability is actually up. That's what I'm finding. I'm finding support for things like, should we be bailing out the airlines or the oil industry? That's just cratered. I really do believe we're at a point where there's a critical jumping off from the old sort of carbon economy, that this has accelerated the view that that's no longer going to be on. I also find, for example, that I didn't typically see a huge generational divide on these issues. There was lots of, seniors were concerned about climate change. And although, we hear that young people were more concerned, I never saw it. Now I'm seeing a striking gap between under 35 Canada and say over 50 Canada on the relative salience of this. So I don't know. I mean, as you said, as we both know, nobody really likes any form of tax, particularly if it applies to them. But I have been polling on the new carbon tax, and I think the public, while they're not going to go, oh, I'm really happy that I'm actually going to have to pay more. That I don't think it's a deal breaker for most Canadians. Obviously, that's not true if you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan. But I think that it's not what you want to put in the store window as, here's the central plank of why you should reelect me. But I think people will go along with it if it's balanced. And that's the other thing I'm finding is that, the undue focus on let's have a Green New Deal. I think people want a more multidimensional New Deal, one which, incorporates health, education, quality of life, racial justice, which is at the highest scores I've seen in 30 years of polling. So I don't think it's going to be simply a question of, let's do a Green New Deal. I think personally that would not be the way I would move forward. That's not where the public are. That could be a central plank or ingredient, but I think it's going to be a more multidimensional sense of a better balancing of society and economy. I think if the broad aspirations for many Canadians is that we had the wrong balancing and we need to reconfigure.
I think that's right. I think that's right. But I am old enough to remember that when Joe Clark and John Crosbie said that they were going to increase the price of a liter of gasoline by 4.5 cents, Ontario voters ran them out of town. And now Trudeau is saying if you elect him, he's going to raise the price of a liter of gasoline by 45 cents.
Yeah. I don't know how this plays out. I do know that on the plus side for Trudeau, that support for dealing with climate change has never been higher. And Canadians have, heroically not walking the talk type, delusionally believe that they are climate champions where they're really not. So I think some of that's abating. I think there is a recognition, and it may be the case that the severity of this particular crisis has said, maybe we can deal with existential crises like climate change. And maybe we can't just continue to punt this or put this in abeyance indefinitely. And particularly if that view, and let's not discount, we have an administration to the south of us that now it says this is going to be a central focus for them. It's always been something of central focus in Europe. So maybe the stars are in alignment to actually see some real progress on this file. I don't know. I wouldn't discount the Joe Clark scenario, but I think it's less likely than it would have been before last year.
If I was the Conservatives, I would be tempted to match the Liberal climate plan in every respect, minus the carbon price. Because I bet Canadians would think that was good enough.
Yeah, no, I think that I would agree with you. That would be pretty shrewd. I don't think most Canadians really understand the economics or the kind of trade-offs of carbon tax versus other types of schemes for dealing with this. I think it's taken as a measure of how authentic or real is the commitment. But yeah, no, I completely agree with you on that point.
All right. Well, you know what, brother? On that, since we agree, we got to wrap up. So thank you for coming on the show. It was your birthday yesterday, so happy birthday, Frank Graves.
Yes. With,
I hope you got yourself a new Porsche.
I have an electric Porsche. I do. I actually do. Hey.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you. And Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to all the listeners of the Herle Burly. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in January.
Thanks, David. Happy New Year to you. Real pleasure being with you.
Thank you. You too.